With free agency set to start for the NBA, we talk about Cameron Johnson's contract and how the decision the Brooklyn Nets may have to make with one player could impact the entire roster for the upcoming season. We dive in next.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Yes, my friends, it is the Locked On Nets podcast right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I am Adam Armbrecht, covering the New York Football Giants on the One Giant podcast with my boy Andy Mack, and preparing for another draft over on the Devil's Puck Luck podcast with Danny McDonough. We thank you for making us your first listen of the day. We are free on all those great platforms. And Doug is not here. So we fly solo as we work our way through the week, preparing for free agency around the NBA, and specifically talking about Cameron Johnson, a player that we've discussed before on the show this offseason, and how his contract potentially could have a ripple effect when it comes to the Brooklyn Nets, Sean Marks, and how they want to construct things going forward. If you are someone who wants to hear about the rumblings of Donovan Mitchell or the feels like demise of the Damian Lillard discussions, we're going to have some bonus stuff coming up here, maybe later today on a Wednesday and throughout Thursday and towards the end of the week as well. So keep an eye for that over on YouTube, which is Doug will always remind you. That's why you need to be over and subscribed on YouTube, because there's just extra stuff going on over there, and there will be more of that coming. Cameron Johnson will discuss not only his situation, his contract, the way it could impact other decisions that Sean Marks needs to make, both positively, potentially, and negatively, and then what the other options will be for the Brooklyn Nets. But as we know, we welcome everybody in on a live edition as well. There is a reality here for the Brooklyn Nets and how they look at Cameron Johnson and specifically where this team can go in the short term, or over a 4-year contract, right? When we think about the latest rumor, and you have a couple of angles from this. One, we know the Detroit Pistons are now the new looming team. Houston Rockets, they're basically tied to every single player that could be a free agent that wants a big contract. But the Detroit Pistons, with Monty Williams, with money to spend, certainly are a team that could get into these waters and offer maybe more than the Brooklyn Nets want to. There's a few factors here. Windhorst reported as of yesterday, and this is just discussions that he's having on ESPN. I think that's Cameron Johnson, probably get around $90 million. If a team comes hunting, he could approach $100 million, maybe not all guaranteed. I think the Nets will match up to that level. So we start there, just on the idea that Cameron Johnson could be a $25 million per year player for the Brooklyn Nets in the upcoming season, or in the NBA at this point. Now, we know the obvious factor, and paraphrasing a couple of quotes here. Following the draft, Sean Marks said when asked about Cameron Johnson, "I don't have a crystal ball. I can't see into the future, and I think we need to expect the unexpected. We've talked with Cameron Johnson. He knows how we feel about him. We want him to be here." Cameron Johnson's also talked glowingly about his experience since coming over in the trade following the deadline with, obviously, Kevin Durant. We know that he has ties to Mikal Bridges, and Mikal has come out and said, "I want him to be here." And also, I find it maybe interesting that Windhorst would say up to $100 million, the Nets are going to be willing to match. I've mentioned this before, going back last month on the podcast, about how having Cameron Johnson on the books, though Mikal Bridges doesn't strike me as the type of player that would be concerned, but having Mikal Bridges on the books for $25 million a year when you've got Mikal Bridges making 21, 22, I just think if you're allocating where you spend, it's really hard to make that commitment to that player at that age. Now, is it getting into the weeds on $22 million a year, $23 million a year? That's totally fine. But $25 million, I'd have to push the brakes on it. The reason why it becomes such an interesting decision is because if you choose to pay him, you're going to have to then essentially commit not only to him and Mikal Bridges and this version of this team, but I think it'll start to take other options off the table. And we'll talk about the pivot of not signing Cameron Johnson and the way I think it could change how Sean Marks approaches this offseason. If the Nets go as far as they need to with Cameron Johnson, and they say, yes, we're going to match it even all the way up to $25 million. We know they have him on the books, so it's easy to pay a guy in-house. But you have to think about, or at least from where I stand, the ramifications that has on luxury tax, the ramifications it has on roster construction. Coming out of the draft, we said, hey, did we think that the Nets, if they could have, would have moved Dorian Finney-Smith or Royce O'Neal? Of course. Do they want to shed a contract like Joe Harris? Yes. Or Patty Mills? Certainly. Can they move off of Ben Simmons even if they wanted to? Most likely not. So you're sitting here and you're talking about having $47 million tied up between not Ben Simmons, between Royce O'Neal, Dorian Finney-Smith, Joe Harris, and Patty Mills, and all that still sits on the books. So if you bring back Cameron Johnson, you might be able to stand pat on keeping the veteran constructed roster with Dorian Finney-Smith and Royce O'Neal. But are you now attaching an asset to dump the salary of Joe Harris? Are you going to eat some money in releasing outright Patty Mills? Because you're going to want to clear off that money somewhere. Otherwise, you're bumping up right against the luxury tax threshold, right against the aprons, and we know how the CBA impacts that. And if you are the Nets and you're Sean Marks and you're Joe Tsai, you were somewhat calculated on draft night, looked for options, weren't willing to part with certain players that you feel have a value to your roster and to the NBA, and Dorian Finney-Smith and Royce O'Neal. And you also signal that they have a value to you in terms of remaining competitive. Bringing back Cameron Johnson at any cost is we want to remain competitive in the short term. It's not about Noah Clowney, not about Dariq Whitehead, not about maybe Cameron Johnson, even Cam Thomas, getting more playing time, though we'll talk about him this offseason too. It's about we are unwilling to sacrifice the competitive level that we want to play at. Doesn't make it a bad thing, but it does impact what you do going forward. Coming up here in a second, we'll flip the script and ask the question, what if the Nets did have a line that they would not cross with Cameron Johnson? How would they pivot off of that with some high-level rumblings, again, about another star potentially coming to join Brooklyn? Before we do that, though, gotta tell you about our friends over at eBay Motors, because you guys know that for a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time that you need parts and accessories, head over to eBay Motors. With eBay's guaranteed fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to my garage. That's to the eBay Motors garage, not my garage, not Doug's garage, the eBay Motors garage, and look for the green check to know that your part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guarantee Fit only available for U.S. customers. Eligible items only, and exclusions, why they do apply. Okay. Let's discuss the pivot. If the Brooklyn Nets and Cameron Johnson get to a place as free agency starts where a team like the Detroit Pistons comes in and says, yes, the Brooklyn Nets want to offer you $90 million over 4 years, but we want to give you $100 million. Dr. Evil, people should know that. I'm going to steal my quote from the end of the show. If that's the case, and we've said that number, that's high enough for us to feel like if I was in Sean Marks' shoes, I could say, sorry, we believe in this player. We like him. We like his fit. We like his relationship with Mikal Bridges. But to go to that level, where currently I think he occupies a $17 million cap hold on the Brooklyn Nets roster right now, But to go to that point, when the team total, looking over using basketballreference.com for this, is sitting at 100, coming next year, 145 million. That's going to push you to 165 million potentially, because they're not accounting for Cameron Johnson's number inside of this. You're going to be at 165 if you bring him back at 20 million, at 25 million, up to 170, and you're into those luxury tax areas potentially, and to those extra costs. So let's say the Nets pivot. I'll give, first of all, two things. One, kudos. If you follow us over on Twitter, at Adam Armbrecht, at Doug Norrie, at Locked On Nets. Yesterday, I was not trolling anybody when I put this out there. I'll paraphrase myself here. I said along the lines of, the Nets fan base seems to be determined to attach the team to a superstar of some kind. And if Damian Lillard's not going to be available, then it's going to be DeJounte Murray. And if DeJounte Murray can't be had, it's going to now be Donovan Mitchell, as rumblings come out of Cleveland and Windhorst suggests that something's coming in Cleveland. Let alone that maybe something's going to Cleveland. The idea is, of course, to be breaking up. I was elated to see the pushback from what I think is, as we always know when it comes to fan bases, it's the vocal minority that talks about needing a superstar, has to happen, got to go do it. But when pressed, the more even-tempered fans, they push to the forefront. And frankly, a lot of guys that come and listen to this podcast and support our show on YouTube, they said, no, we don't need a superstar. We can be slow and steady. We can continue to build. So when we think about potentially getting to a place where the Brooklyn Nets say $25 million a year, $100 million contract, it's too rich for us. I think that can be a walkaway number for Sean Marks, and there wouldn't be much of a backlash in terms of saying, hey, you got this player in the trade, you can't afford to let him go. But what do they do in the interim? So I think it'd be far less likely that the Nets use their TPE upwards of $18 million if they're bringing back Cameron Johnson. Not because those dollars are one-to-one and you spend it on retaining a player and you can't spend it there. It's not true. You can utilize that money. But I would say that the Nets would look at their roster and, again, go back to we like Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson, Spencer Dinwiddie, Dorian Finney-Smith, Nicholas Claxton, Royce O'Neal coming off the bench, and then we can have a deeper discussion about what they lack coming in off that bench there. Cam Thomas is in that discussion. I feel like sometimes we sell ourselves short mentioning his name when we should. He is in that group. But how do you construct a healthy second unit for this team? I think Cameron Johnson returns. I think the team returns by and large going into this season. If Cameron Johnson doesn't return, then all of a sudden you turn your attention to a Dorian Finney-Smith. And I think you say, where is your value? Is it diminished if you don't have a Cameron Johnson on the floor right now? And who are you replacing Cameron Johnson with? Taking away some of the bigger names that are going to be on the board there. You're not necessarily going to rise to that level of, yes, we can replace a one-to-one comp of that guy. We'll talk about free agent guys, by the way, coming up here throughout the next 2 days. So we're going to talk about backcourt players. I've seen a lot of names get mentioned there. We're coming off of the Cole Anthony discussion in yesterday's episode. Go check that one out with Doug Norrie and myself as we break things down a little bit 2 days ago. And then we'll also talk about adding more depth in the front court. But if Cameron Johnson's not coming back on a $90 million contract, I won't be shocked if Dorian Finney-Smith actually ends up getting utilized in a trade. I wouldn't be shocked if this team ends up sitting here and potentially saying, we're going to reconstruct with obviously Mikal Bridges as a centerpiece, but we may end up trending a little bit younger. We may end up pushing our mentality and our approach to, we don't spend the $25 million on Cameron Johnson. We can also get off of the $13 million of Dorian Finney-Smith and go back to that payroll. Suddenly you drop yourself from 145 coming into this year, and instead of ballooning up towards 170, you drop yourself down into the 132 range. And then you can go and use maybe your TPE and your MLE to get a backcourt player, to get a front court player, right? You can go ahead and lean into those non-cap implication moves to still keep yourself competitive. And this is going to be pretty determinant about how we look at Sean Marks and this Brooklyn Nets organization, specifically the GM. Because you can go back and say the execution of the trade with Kyrie Irving in Dallas, hard to argue with what you get back. At least valuable assets, at least commodities, right? Hard to, can't, won't debate that he got everything possible and more than we maybe thought he could in the trade with the Phoenix Suns. Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson, 4 first-round picks. Also, the pastor that got some extra second-rounders, sending, tip of my tongue, Crowder, got there, through to the Milwaukee Bucks, right? He did it. But what does it look like coming out of it? And how do you pivot from those moves? It is going to be as critical as anything. Cameron Johnson, just to be clear, is a player that, for whatever you thought, looking at him coming over from the trade initially, and we talked about, you go in and you look at his game logs and you think about the end of the season where he was putting up, and I think we'll go ahead and hit that mark here. He comes over to the Brooklyn Nets. By the way, like that first run that he comes over, just from a point standpoint, 12, 14, 18, 10, 27, 19. He averages 17 points nearly in the entire month of April. And then you go in towards the playoffs, that final little stretch there, averages, again, 16 points again coming in. The percentages from beyond the arc is what was concerning for Cameron Johnson coming over and getting into a role where the spotlight is elevated for him. He came in the door and had what? Really no problems coming in over here, coming into Brooklyn. No real problems at the gate. Didn't have much of an issue. And then you get into those, we get into January, February, March. We get into March there. Had 1 for 7 performances, 2 for 6, 3 for 7, 2 for 6, 1 for 6, 1 for 4, right? Now, the expansion of his game in other areas, like when you look over towards the back end of that month and we're seeing 7 of 13 from the field, 11 of 18 from the field, 9 of 13 from the field. It's the other areas of his game, 23, 31-point performances, that you really want to look at and say, can we extrapolate that out? And when we saw that playoff series against the Philadelphia 76ers, where we know the Nets were swept 18, 28, 17. And then the final game, understanding, not an excuse for him, not an excuse for Mikal, not an excuse for anybody, but the Nets were essentially fried. They had nothing left because they're running a very lean team with no bench, no key contributors for the most part, outside of a Royce O'Neal, giving you anything at all in that playoff series. He shot 66, 45, and 40% from beyond the arc in the first 3 games of that series. He shot 64, 58, and 50% from the field in that series. Didn't get to the line nearly as much as we may have wanted him to with some of the efforts we saw down the stretch of the season. But the question becomes, for 20, 21, 22, 24, $25 million, can you set the expectation that Cameron Johnson is going to be closer to a 20-plus point performer than a 15 on a night in, night out basis? 16 points a night, not going to be good enough for $25 million a year on a team as currently constructed. He is the number 2 option on this roster. And he needs to be a guy that can get you 20 consistently, efficiently, night in and night out. So if the Nets move off of him, there's the potential that some of these other pieces start to crumble. Coming up here in a moment, we'll talk about what the other moves could be for the Brooklyn Nets, if not Cameron Johnson, or if they feel like they need to balance the books in retaining him. What would the fallout be from there? We'll look at other roster free agents that the Nets may want to retain, coming up here in a second. All right. So remember, when we look over at the Brooklyn Nets roster and we think about what this team had by the end of the season, a couple of things come to mind and a couple of key players. One other name I didn't mention there, as we discussed the potential $25 million a year, $100 million contract that could be offered to Cameron Johnson by the Detroit Pistons. Spencer Dinwiddie, Mikal Bridges, Cameron Johnson, Dorian Finney-Smith, and Nicholas Claxton. If Cameron Johnson goes away, I've already been skeptical that Spencer Dinwiddie was going to be talked about in trades, that Spencer Dinwiddie was going to get moved. I know it's an expiring contract at $20 million, but I don't think the Nets brought him back to then just move off of him immediately. Now, if this thing all falls apart, maybe they do. Makes it easier to sit on his $20 million. It makes it easier for the Brooklyn Nets not to worry about Joe Harris's money either, right? Because if Cameron Johnson walks out the door and the Nets go with the TPMLE to try to fill the void of what they're going to lose in Cameron Johnson, we mentioned that before, 145, right? Say essentially that number stays the same. The world where the Nets move off of Dorian Finney-Smith and move off of Joe Harris and move off of, let's put Patty Mills in there. Let's keep Royce O'Neal because he's a veteran. He's versatile. He showed his ability to play in the backcourt at times as well. You're going to need that in the short term. But those three players alone represent $40 million in cap space. The Nets don't have to move off of that number, but they could. Now the question becomes, do you have the desire to go get another player, and you want to throw out any name that you want? You want to throw out DeJounte Murray. You want to throw out Donovan Mitchell. Like, say whoever you want. But from the lowest level to the highest level, you want to even look, Golden State Warriors, talk about Kuminga's been talked about a lot. None of these aren't one-to-ones, right? But going and getting a guy. You want to look out at Chicago, and I don't think this is likely because Chicago seems destined to run it back this year. But you want to look at an Alex Caruso and say, hey, what would it take to get that veteran point guard, put him into our backcourt so we bring ourselves back up here a level, and he's a relatively low cost? Are you willing to attach draft capital now to go acquire players here? Because now it's not even about the numbers anymore. You have the room. You can move one or two of these other pieces. You can pick up with one move and then pick up a $20 to $25 million contract from somewhere else. Maybe that's in the 24, 25-year-old range, not at the 27, going to be 28-year-old range. So it feels more palatable. You can go make that move. But is Sean Marks now going to say, I will attach some of that draft capital? Because then what you're saying is the Kevin Durant trade becomes this. It's all retroactive. It's all in hindsight. But when we say Kevin Durant became 4 first-round picks and some swaps, etc., but Mikal Bridges and Cameron Johnson, if before the next season begins, Cameron Johnson, because of the contract that you knew potentially was going to be coming for him, if he ends up going to another roster, now you're going to say the Kevin Durant trade ultimately turned into Mikal Bridges and what? Did it turn into another superstar player via a sign and trade with Cameron Johnson? And would the Nets go down that road? Whether it's Detroit, whether it's Houston, can the Nets get into a sign and trade possibility in order to recoup some value from the Detroit Pistons or otherwise? I'm sure they would want to explore that option. For me, it's two things. One, I suspect that the number does not end up necessarily being 25 million. I think that Detroit wants Cameron Johnson, but I don't know if it actually gets that high. Remember, he turned down Cameron Johnson. I think it was a $78 million a year offer from the Phoenix Suns. Now, marginally getting up to 90, that's 12 million more over the life of a contract. Should he just be willing to say, thank you so much? Of course not. If there's more money to be had, if you're one of the top 10 free agents on the market, which is what he is in this offseason, you have to go as far as you can to get as much as you can. Because, by the way, this may be the last big contract, the last big cash that Cameron Johnson sees. By the time this is over, he'll be 31, going to be 32. There'll still be money out there for him. I'm not saying there won't be, but not at the $20+ million range. That seems highly unlikely. So getting as much as you can matters. I don't think that Cameron Johnson walks away. But in the event that he does, I think you will see some shedding of salaries, and the Nets try to go acquire another number 2. And put it in context, like with what the Nets currently have in Mikal Bridges. Making $21 million, was considered to be the fourth option on another team, immediately jumps up. By most accounts, you would say this is a player that is a high level 1B. You'd like to have a 1A, but you believe there is still something more there for him to show you. If that's the case, the Nets can go get a high level number 2, a guy that, no, if you were comprising your roster, you wouldn't say, what I want to have is not quite an elite number 1, but a solid number 1. Not quite the elite number 2, but a solid number 2. If the Nets go and do that, all of a sudden they'll be able to look back and say, this upcoming season will remain competitive. We can tweak our roster. We can look for Noah Clowney to develop in the background, look for Dariq Whitehead to develop in the background, look for Cam Thomas to develop in the foreground and become a bigger contributor for this team. And if I'm just looking over at the 3 spot and talking about free agents out there, yeah, there's Chris Middleton. That's not going to happen. There's Kyle Kuzma, who wants $30 million. He'll end up back in Washington. Then there's Cameron Johnson. Listen, Dylan Brooks, a guy on the outs right now, needing to reclimate himself a little bit. Is he going to be anywhere near $25 million a year, $20 million a year, $15 million a year? Like, where does he fall? There's some potential there. If you bring these numbers down and create the cap space to actually go out and outright sign a player that you otherwise wouldn't be able to when you currently look at the situation for the Nets. Club options on a couple other players, Jay Crowder, Kelly Oubre, unrestricted free agent with early bird rights there. Interesting just to keep an eye on what happens with him. And then you're getting into older heads, man. Torrey Craig and Joel Ingles and, a bunch of other dudes. By the way, 12th on that list at the 3, Yuta Watanabe. And that's just the last note that I'll leave you with here. When we go back and look and why retaining Cameron Johnson is critical and why you hope these numbers don't get too high and that Sean Marks isn't pushed to make a difficult decision. After the starting 5, Seth Curry's gone. Joe Harris may still be on this roster, but we understand what he is and more importantly, what he is not. Royce O'Neal, Ben Simmons, question mark. Then it's Cam Thomas, Edmund Sumner, Day'Ron Sharpe, Patty Mills, Yuta Watanabe. Like, there's not a lot concrete set behind here. And it makes me wonder about, quietly, a player like Yuta Watanabe and if the Nets get him back at the right price, just because at least he showed that he could play NBA minutes, right? Because otherwise you could get very young very quickly or get backed into a corner where you need to spend. That is the deal, my friends. We'll keep an eye on the Cameron Johnson conversation and where that money ultimately lies. I think the Nets in the front office are willing to go higher than maybe the fan base would, but I do wonder if it gets to that $100 million line, would Brooklyn be willing to match, knowing how quickly you can reconstruct your financial situation and be just a moment away from, for better or worse, being off of the Ben Simmons money as well, right? It's a fascinating kind of scenario here. Again, I'll reiterate, I tend to assume that Cameron Johnson is back with Brooklyn. I tend to assume that it may not get all the way to offers coming in from other teams and that the Nets would prefer to maybe keep that in-house. A little bit of a game of chicken here about letting him go to market and allowing the market to dictate where his value is. We will come back in and talk about backcourt free agents, front court free agents, and building depth for this Brooklyn Nets roster. I have a list of names. People have thrown out other guys that we should look at, especially in the backcourt. I can go ahead and then we can look at Chicago and a little bit of a log jam for them. We can look at Charlotte and a couple of players. We can look around free agency as well. So we're going to give you the landscape of where things lie. Be sure to be here for those. We may have a guest lined up for the end of the week here. But as I also mentioned at the top, for bonus conversations, just around the Damian Lillard piece, just around the Donovan Mitchell piece, just around the DeJounte Murray piece, because I think that there's things in-house for Brooklyn that are so important to what's going on right now, I want to compartmentalize, if I can, episodes about Cameron Johnson and what matters most for Brooklyn in the short term, and then do a global picture, right? Didn't get a chance to talk about the John Collins trade and him going to Utah and what that looks like and how that seems to be impacting the NBA landscape and what is Atlanta's future. Maybe there's something there that the Brooklyn Nets can nibble around the edges of and find a way to improve their roster. We'll do all of that coming up throughout the remainder of this week, and then the return of the great and powerful Doug, the man behind the curtain. He's actually just a man on vacation. And since he's not here, I'll first tell you, get over to YouTube, get over to the podcast feed, subscribe it, support it, like it, love it, appreciate everybody that got it this morning. If everyone enjoyed this, comment in the YouTube channel. We'll do a couple more lives like this. Maybe I'll even right now stick around for just a few minutes because there were a lot of comments and questions. So we'll do it just like our post-game lives, wrap up the official show, and then stick around for a few extra moments. But you got to be over and subscribed on YouTube for all the extra content. And with no Doug, there is no quote short of saying, I miss my friend and I can't wait until he's back so we can keep talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball. All right, 5-minute bonus session here, guys. Thank you for joining in on this, man. I asked over on Twitter, hey, normal midnight drop, or do you want to see me bright and early and pale-faced in the morning? Surprisingly, you guys wanted some of this at 8 a.m. So shout out to everybody in the chat. Some of the usual suspects like Claude, Saw Clash, Bandicoot in there. Billy the Kid, thanks for coming in. Al Mac, frequent flyer. We refer to these on the network every day. Guys that just keep showing up, keep supporting the show. And we, of course, appreciate everybody. Just looking through some of the comments here, like from Tengo, who says, well, I tend to disagree. I think, one, it was a great podcast. Do I agree that the Nets are not winning a championship anytime soon? Yeah. Guess what? Only one team wins the championship, my friend. So otherwise, you got to have a whole different conversation around what you think an NBA season or sports seasons in general are supposed to be. But thank you for supporting the show. Adam, you are the man. Boom. That's the comments we like to see. Shout out to Clash. Yeah, backup point guard. So I'm going to go into these a little bit deeper tomorrow. But for me, so there's a couple of guys that have been mentioned before. Let me go ahead. I'll just pull this up here just to give everybody the tease of the direction of some things that have been mentioned, and then guys that I think are targetable. The list of pure point guard list here, obviously, I'm pushing past the Fred VanVleets of the world, the D'Angelo Russells, not interested in him, even if the Nets get the money right. Pat Bev probably going to stay there. Russell Westbrook, that's like mildly interesting to me in conjunction with another move. One guy I'll keep an eye on because I've heard some things about this. We'll break down more. Dennis Schroeder, Schroeder, whichever way you want to go. He's at least mildly interesting to me. I've heard people ask about Dosunmu out of Chicago because they also have Kobe White, because they also have the veteran there and Alex Caruso. It's hard to gauge where the market is for Kobe White. He's a restricted free agent, as is Dosunmu. My inclination is they like the where they're going, both of those players. One more defensive minded, one in Kobe White who's just coming into his own. But again, if I had to make a pivot, am I willing to maybe do an offer there on Kobe White? We'll talk about that tomorrow in more detail. There was a guy Dennis Smith Jr. I'll tell you now. I'll explain why tomorrow. Not interested in pursuing him. He's been mentioned, I know, by some fans as a guy to go after. After that, I'll even tell you too, another guy that we didn't mention in the Orlando show with a club option for $3.1 million, been dealing with injuries. Michael Carter Williams. We'll just explain that situation and go into him a little bit more. And then you have who just walked away, right? Deladova, unrestricted, coming out of the Kings. But who was the one other player? There's one other guy that I had thought about. Another guy that I'll maybe discuss would be like a player like Aaron Holiday. And by the way, man, like the point in all of these names, yeah, and by the way, and this is my holy king, man. Exactly. I think we kind of known Yeah, I think most people kind of know what D'Angelo Russell is. It's not a knock on him, but there's a limit to how high that value is. And let me also say, um, Jean Remy or Remy, probably Remy, right? Um, the going young is something that the Nets could explore as well. And Anthony, the reason why I'm talking about, I don't have to put up the ones with like the all blasted caps because it just seems very aggressive. The reason why we're talking about, listen, this is a spectrum, right? Old veterans, partially washed, guys with upside, guys, whatever. It's because the price point is going to be correct here. I don't see the Nets going out and saying we're going to spend big money. Again, they have the TPE. They can get up to $18 million in an offer potentially. But you have to balance two things here. I want to get a guy that has the upside, pure point guard that has upside if I can, younger player if I can. And I have a thought on that as well, that goes even to the lowest possible level of pursuits. And then I also believe, as who just said it, King, as you mentioned there as well, that you do need to have a veteran presence here, and that's when you look at guys that it's not about whether or not you think they're still at the same level they once were. It's just about bringing in experience, bringing in a baseline, and bringing in value at the position. Last one here from Jonathan. How do you feel about Andre Drummond or Mason Plumlee as possible backup centers for Claxton? Yeah, I'm not interested in Drummond. You know, Plumlee, was he 32, going to be 33. He'll have a market. Players like this, by the way, more so with Plumlee, like contending teams will look at players like this and and they'll see the value of them being backups for their roster, right? Spelling their centers. And so I only say that to remind everybody that like the price point becomes different here. Some teams are going to value both ways. Some teams are going to value it higher for what it is to their team and their agenda this upcoming season, and they're going to pay a little bit more. Or the player is looking around the league at 32 and 33 years old and saying, "Hey, I'm looking to be on a championship caliber team where I have a chance to win a championship," right? So those factors, I think sometimes we look at it and say, "Here's what this player is going for on the market. We should go get him." The player is also going to make that choice when they're an unrestricted free agent. And I think when the dollars are relatively close, you have to consider it. And we will talk about as well. I see Sumner getting brought up. We're going to talk about him too. He's in that conversation. And I'll just address the other one here that you're bringing up here, King. Why is it so hard to get rid of Joe Harris? Because it's $20 million. You know, it's $20 million. And you talk about D'Angelo Russell getting exposed in the NBA playoffs. Joe Harris has just been getting exposed by time, it looks like. He doesn't have defensive value. He has limited offensive value. The spot up shooting, great. But again, think about it from this standpoint. I just mentioned, if you're a contending team and you look across the landscape and you identify a guy and you say, "Oh, he really adds to what we can do here." Where has Joe Harris come up the smallest in the playoffs, right? So regular season value isn't what championship level teams are looking for in a $20 million check. They're looking for a guy that gets them over the line when it comes to the big moments, right? We need a knockdown, three-point assassin for playoff basketball. And unfortunately, Joe Harris has proven himself to be elite in the regular season and suspect in the postseason. What was the one other one here? Yeah, I think they will. So we're going to add that too. Yeah, I know I said point guard, back court, and then like adding front court depth. I think there's something that they're going to look to do here. But again, it really is a balancing of the books here for the Brooklyn Nets. How much are you going to invest in the short term? What do the contracts look like from a length standpoint? Because the last thing I'll say before I get out of here is remember, the Brooklyn Nets want to be competitive, but they don't want to be overcommitted. Like the Nets want to have the option 2 seasons from now. And you can go back and watch the episode with Howard Beck where he talked about this. And it was a little bit disheartening to say, hey, 2 years from now, the Nets want to be able to look at Mikal Bridges and at the roster in totality and what happened over the next 2 years and say, if it isn't going the way we hope, we still have a player on a very team-friendly contract that we could move for another big collection of draft capital. And no, you don't want to be in the perpetual selling of value and getting picks, but depending on how things go these next 2 years, that is very much on the table. So committing to somebody, backup or otherwise, at a level and at a number that you don't feel like is going to be movable or is going to be digestible under the cap with the current constraints they have, I think that's what the Nets are going to want to avoid. So we'll come back in, though. There's a lot to discuss here. So over the next 2.5 days, including today, you should see a lot of me in bonus content, 10-minute episodes for YouTube. Try to get them on the regular podcast feed as well. They'll all go up. They'll all get out there. And we'll continue to break down what these options are. And it's going to be the balance. Trade targets, free agent targets, in-house players, right? And trying to construct a balanced and deep, fingers crossed, deep team for the Brooklyn Nets going forward here. Absolutely love everybody coming into this. Again, cannot thank you enough. Having this many people in a live on a Wednesday morning is incredible. So we'll continue to try to get these worked in there when opportunities present themselves, and I'll be back. So keep yourself in, keep yourself alert. Follow us over on Twitter. Thank you, everybody. Really appreciate it as always. We'll be back again next time talking all things Brooklyn Nets basketball.